I'm in South London. That's still part of the UK.
So welcome everybody. This is I think this is our 6th eLN webinar, and all I'm going to do now is very briefly introduce our two speakers today. They are Mark Berthelemy and Myles Runham, and I think I'll let you both introduce yourselves. Off you go.
Thanks, Joan. So I'll start. I'm Mark Berthelemy. I'm a learning technology consultant based in Derbyshire, in the middle of the UK, working mainly with larger organisations on complex learning technology implementations. Myles?
Hi, thanks, Mark. I'm Myles Runham. I'm an independent consultant, mainly working in learning technologies and probably more in digital product development, user experience and digital strategy. Similar to Mark, working with a variety of clients on helping sort of plan digital implementations and helping to understand themes around user experience and user needs.
Great, thank you, Myles. So this afternoon, the way it's going to work is I'm going to do about 15 to 20 minutes of setting out what the problem is as I see it, and how we show how we use real-world techniques in our learning and training within our organisations. And then Myles is going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes coming up with all the answers. Well, that's the plan anyway. And at the end, we'll take questions. But if you have questions that pop into your head as we go through, please put them into the chat room, and Joan will be picking them up and saving them for the end so that we can then collect everything together. So without further ado, one of my favourite authors is a guy called Charles Handy, who speaks and writes a lot on management and organisational techniques and development things. And I love this quote, that anyone can learn anything provided they want to enough. It just rings true to me that a lot of the time we have the problem that people don't learn really in our organisations because they don't really want to. They don't care enough about it, about what we're wanting them to learn. The picture of the baby is there because a lot of people say they can't learn languages, but everyone learns a language, at least one language. So we can all learn languages. It's just we choose not to. The motivation isn't there for it. Just put a statement on the screen that says most e-learning only achieves a fraction of its potential impact. And I'm wondering, what are your reactions to that statement? And if you could put your initial thoughts into the chat room, it'd be great to get your reactions on that. So Fiona's asked why does e-learning only achieve a fraction of its potential impact? Brilliant question. So a lot of people are agreeing with it. So it feels like it's a shame. If is that accepted, or can we do something better? Yeah, a lot of e-learning is forced. Hard to capture everything that you need, poor design, unexpected impact sometimes, too much at once and no practice after. Okay, excellent. Keep on putting your reactions in. It would be useful for other people to see them. I would suggest that there are two main reasons why this happens. Is that there's limited engagement with what we're putting out there. People aren't motivated with it, and most of the time the e-learning is single use only. So, and I give an example of that. I did a project with the National Health Service a few years back where we put out some e-learning materials, really well designed, really clear, brilliant e-learning materials, if I say so myself. I didn't write it, I was on the team. But it didn't get the maximum impact because people wanted to go back and find stuff afterwards to use as reference material, but it wasn't designed for that. It was designed to work through once and once only. So we ended up having to reproduce it as reference materials as well. And wouldn't it be great if the same materials could be used in more than one scenario? So more than as they work through, but also for reference afterwards. They get much more impact. So let's have a look at some of the ways that people learn outside of our organisations. 2 old school examples. If you want to learn something new, you're in a new field, you might buy a book or you might buy a magazine. And my bookshelf's full of books that I've bought to help me to get over the hump of a brand new situation. And let's think about the characteristics of those things. They're easy to navigate. We know how to use them. They're searchable if they've got an index. They're user-driven. I can jump in and out of it at any point. I can go to the middle of the book if I want to, or a particular section in the magazine. I'm not locked down to only go through from start to finish. Another example, a friend of mine, his daughter got to music college to be taught violin, but to get to music college, she taught herself. She did not have a teacher before she actually went to full-time music college. She taught herself violin to a sufficient standard to get into professional training, and she did it through YouTube. There are so many examples of learning materials on YouTube. They're easy to find, they're easy to get to. They're usually in small chunks, and they will work on any device. Wouldn't it be great how our materials could be as simple to use as that? And another example, this is one I put on YouTube, and just to give you an example of how cost effective it is. So this one, it's had 158,000 views. This was a couple of months ago. It was just how to change a headlamp bulb. If you think, even if 10% of those stopped someone going to a shop to get someone to change the bulb for them, the amount of money that's been saved. And that video took an hour to put up. Again, wouldn't it be great if our materials could prove themselves to be as cost effective as that? One of the sites I use a lot for when I'm working with web technologies is this W3 Schools. It has tutorials that you can work through step by step if you're a new user, but you can jump in at any point. If you're a returning user, you can come back to it. It's in small chunks and it's searchable. I can get to it, a specific part of this, just by using Google. And just while we talk about that, Google actually is a starting point for a learning journey for most people, I would suggest. How do we replicate that in our organizations? Another example, real-world learning, is the Manager Tools podcast, with hundreds of thousands of people using it, listening to it every week, contributing on the forums and in the comments. It provides small chunks specific to how you deal with particular management issues. It's consistent in its structure. It's immediately applicable. It's easy to get to, and a brilliant community. Wouldn't it be great if our learning tools and techniques can have the same impact that this is happening? I don't know if you've come across Instructables, but again, it's a consistent format. It shows people how to do something, how to build something, or how to make something, or how to do a particular thing in a very simple step-by-step format. And the platform's there, it's easy to use, you just have to put the content into it. Really, really useful and easy applicable tool. So a question for you. Where do your learning journeys typically start? If you're if you have a need to learn something, where do you go to? If you can put your answers in the chat room. Hey, Google, YouTube, any others? Twitter, YouTube, Google or YouTube. Yeah, I'll give you an example. I was working with a public sector organization who will remain nameless. They had hundreds of e-learning modules in their learning management system. They had a massive reference library online. Where did people go to find out how their organization worked? They went to Google and ended up on their public-facing website because the systems that they put inside the organization were too complicated to use. So again, the question, how can we replicate that inside our organizations? Josh Bursin, who's one of the best analysts around at the moment, describes two types of learning. There's the learning where you need help now, or there's the learning where you want to learn something completely brand new. And he suggests that actually there are two ways you can, two places you might end up for those two types of learning. If you want to learn something short and get you over a very quick need, you would end up in somewhere like YouTube or an article, a blog article, or a tutorial, or a little piece of reference material. If you're going for something that you want to learn new, you would go to something bigger, like a book or a trusted provider to help you with a course or something like that. It's useful to think about those two types of learning as we bring that into our organizations. How can we think, or do we need to think, are we always going to just be providing a course, or do we sometimes actually need to be providing more reference, small micro learning type pieces? And Jay Cross, who is one of my heroes, he died last year. He came up with this brilliant analysis of these two types of learning. So the macro learning is the red line, the micro learning is the blue line. And as people's competence in a particular area goes up, the need for macro learning goes down and their need for micro learning goes up. So when we're looking at creating learning materials, are we only thinking about the people who are starting from low competence, or are we also thinking about the people who are starting at high competence and how we can support those as well? So I would say there are a number of characteristics of real-world learning, which I've mentioned up to now. That they're small, they're granular. They might lump together to make larger pieces, but you can get to small elements very, very easily. They're searchable, and particularly searchable through a search engine like Google. And I wonder how many of our organizations have internal search engines that can find little granular bits of information across all the different systems and websites and intranet sites that we put into our organizations. Certainly, most learning management systems are not good on the search side of things. They're shareable, and that partly comes back to their being granular, because you can each small bit has a link. You can share that link, whether it's on an internal social media system or email or whatever. It's easy to say to someone, why don't you have a look at this particular thing to help you? They follow web standards. There's no SCORM anywhere out in real world learning. You'll never see it. You only see that inside. There are no plugins needed. There are no pop-ups. It's all HTML5. They follow web conventions. So why do we do something different inside our organizations? They generally have a consistent user experience, so that you know how to use them. You don't have to think about what I need to do next. And that book that I've noted down there on the bottom right, Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think book, I think should be essential reading for everyone involved in learning design, learning technology. And because his whole thing is we need to get people to where they want to go, where they need to go, without them having to think about how they're getting there. They are generally simple. All the examples that I've given up to now, they don't have complex interactions to click and reveal or drag and drops and things like that. They're providing simple information. That's what most people need in their learning journeys. And there are multiple ways to get there. You can browse to them, you can search for them, you can go to them through a link that someone shared with you. So a year or two back, I was doing some work with civil service learning, and they did a big research project across the civil service about what are people's learning needs. Oh, well, actually, it was higher level than that. What are people's needs that then learning can support? And they came up with four different high-level needs or goals that individuals wanted from learning. They need learning so they can have a job in the future, so to improve themselves. They need learning so they could do their current job better. They need learning so they can actually get a better job, and they need learning to feel good about themselves. Those four needs then drove a whole curriculum design project around, okay, how can we get people to the learning they need to meet these particular goals? Most of the time, people aren't going to say they need compliance training, but what they need is materials, training that can help them achieve these goals on the screen. So Myles is going to take over at this point and talk about the how we get to supporting these needs.
Okay.
So I'll click through, Myles, and you tell me.
Okay, you're going to do that. Sure. Okay. So what I want to talk to you about is some of the tools and techniques and frameworks about understanding those user needs in a way that a lot of organizations that use all the tools that people have been mentioning in the chat and the ones that Mark has been referencing that tend to work. So this is about sort of, I suppose, an insight. It's what you can see on the screen there of the kind of product management way of thinking. One of the challenges in my experience of working in the learning and development world is that there's a kind of hierarchy of people's understanding of what users are really trying to do, what they're trying to get done, and what they really need. And unfortunately, a lot of the feedback and guidance we will receive is from stakeholders and SMEs, who I think are probably the furthest away from a really understanding users' needs. I'd say then probably the L&D and HR world is still some distance. I think there's a new group of professionals called product managers, and we'll come back to some of the tools that they use and the ways they think, who start to really develop and focus on that theme of user-centered design. But really, the people who understand best what users need are users themselves. And I think that's what I'm going to try and talk about quickly now is a few ways of thinking about that and a few of the tools and techniques. Could I have the next slide, Mark, please? Thanks. So the stakeholder problem. Those who are classical historians amongst you, of which I'm sure there are many, recognize Zeus. So that one of the challenges from stakeholders' point of view is that these tend to be senior people or subject specialists who are working at quite a distance from the coalface that users and learners are working at. And they'll tend to articulate a learning need or a learner's need in an idealized way. So often they'll describe what they would like the users to want rather than what they actually do want and need. And this is a real problem, I think, in trying to overcome that so that we can spend our time designing content and designing experiences and products that address those very singular needs that Mark was talking about. Can I have the next one, please? So one of the I spent a lot of time last year working with a major retail client in the UK, and we were doing a lot of research with different kinds of users in the organization, different kinds of learners, and each time we came back to the point of answering this question from a user's perspective: what's in it for me? And I think, as we've seen previously, that from a compliance point of view, or for a lot of programs, can be quite heavy. They're there for an organizational purpose. Even if there is an individual learner and user purpose there, that can be quite obscure and quite hard to understand. So this became a watchword for the work that the team have been doing, and they've used this for content development. They're now using it to completely overhaul their learning content portal to answer the question, what's in it for me? For me, and it's an important point about empathy, is for me is really understand who those me's are and what they need. So that's a kind of that becomes the rallying cry for user-focused design. So I wanted to think a little bit as well about, so if user-focused design is about developing a good user experience, I think there's another challenge is in trying to unpick what user experience is and how it differs from user interface. And I think one of the challenges we often deal with, particularly in dealing with lots of learning providers and technology providers, they make claims around user experience when in fact what they're talking about is UI and user interface. I think what we need to focus on is thinking about the user experience from a more genuine perspective and a more fundamental way. So it's about user experience rather than user interface. Next, please, Mark. Thanks. So this is one way of trying to unpick that, trying to offer a little bit more of a framework about what user experience is and how UI can fit into that. So a user experience is really the whole thing. It's the whole experience of using a product, a service, or a piece of content. So that includes what motivates the user and the learner, as Mark's talked about. Why would they care? What's pushing them? Would they choose to do this? If they're not choosing, then what is this a compulsive motivation? What are the needs underneath that motivation? Things like how will they discover, will they and search for and within the experience? How can they find it? Are they aware of it? And it's about the whole product as well. So it's about how the navigation works. It's about the content within it as well. It's about how easy it is to access. And crucially, the last point there on the left-hand side is about satisfaction. So there was a really important point in user experience, which is actually quite an emotional experience as well. And I think everybody would recognize this. When you have a really good user experience, it genuinely feels good. You feel satisfied, you feel maybe it's pleasurable, it's pleasant, it makes you feel better. And that's a really, really important component of a powerful user experience. So UI and user interface are really important in these, but these are smaller kind of tactical elements that you have to get right. But you can't fix a user experience by only fixing the user interface. So things like the design, the look and feel, the layout of pages and screens, the images, the links you use, etc. These are important because they're important ways of making something usable, but those alone won't always fix or generate a good user experience. Thanks, Mark. And it's an important point as well, and this is something that that was drummed into me from working for many years in the search engine business, trying to compete with Google, which I would not recommend for anybody's career options. The notion of show, don't tell. You offer users in trying to understand what they need, show them things, get them to do things, get them to respond, because often users don't necessarily know exactly what they want. So they'll have a sense that something's not working but find it difficult to articulate what would be better, or actually you can end up with some theoretical responses from users, and that doesn't help you design something. It doesn't help you actually make something that's useful. So show, don't tell is a useful principle, and I'll come back to some options for how you can start to investigate different ways of prototyping and designing as well. Thanks, Mark. So what's behind then understanding those user needs is there's various different forms of user research to get to what it is that will motivate people, how they'll use something, and what the outcomes are. And the quote for this one is just always ask your users, and there's various different ways of doing this. Listen to what they do, but crucially don't just listen to what they say they would do, observe actually what they do. That's really where the crucial user understanding will come from. There's different ways, I think, of doing this. There's many different routes. Some of them are more active and some of them are more research based. From my point of view, one of the best are probably workshops and user tests, where you can bring users into a room, into a space with you, and help them. They can help you design what they want as well, so they can work on the solution with you. You can do that in very simple ways with paper prototyping. You can bring stakeholders into those workshops as well if you have access in a single location. You can film them and record them to share as well. The workshops are very good for a more exploratory understanding, trying to help develop something from an early point that might be quite conceptual, or at the beginning of a project, or at the beginning of a content development project. User tests are really fundamentally important, usually conducted one-on-one, where you have a user try something out, actually to use a product or a service, or to run through some content, and that you can see what they're doing, as well as them telling you what they're doing. You can see what they're doing, see where they're stuck. Guerrilla testing is a kind of similar but much simpler and cheaper approach, where you actually just take an option out, either on paper or on a phone or on a laptop or an iPad, or a tablet, and just go out into your workplace or amongst your user group and just simply ask a very, very few simple questions. Do you like this option? Do you like that option? Do you understand how to use this? How would you change it? That's something you can do very, very quickly and simply, as well with any project, and I'd recommend that. There's also more typical research of focus groups or user interviews where you can explore people's motivations, and help that, and get a sort of understanding of their background and their profile. Any and all of these are very, very helpful techniques, and I would say that are useful under any circumstances. So, for example, when you're conducting those tests, it's really important to give people concrete and real tasks. What you want is real information from real people who are trying to do something realistic. So this is some examples of tasks that you might set someone to try and understand their motivations and their needs, and understand how they use something. So, for example, use a portal to find out how to book a meeting room, and then book the room for 4 people for tomorrow lunchtime. It's a concrete, simple, realistic example of a test. Ask people how it went for them. You can see what they do, or you can ask them to find content. You can ask them to find something specific or something more general, and ask them how that goes, and observe what they do to get a sense of how far or close you are from how well that's working. And crucially, behind that, and as part of that work, I think it's really, really important, and this is one of the things that I've found over many years now, working with stakeholders of various different types, particularly more distant and more senior stakeholders. You need to bring your users to life, not just for yourself, but I think for others as well, so you can really tell the story of who they are, what they need, and also express some of the context around that. Can I have the next one, Mark, please? So a really useful technique which some people might use, and this is a kind of a classic, generally of the world of digital product development and digital design, is to create one or more personas that help you answer the question of who are we making this for and why do they need it. This is a way it's tempting to just sort of dash these off, but these need to be built on real data and real research and insight. And you need a bit of a personal story there. Pictures are helpful, a name, give them a background, bring them to life, some background about their professional and work experience, their tenure, their role, where they work, who they work with, some of that sort of typical way they would spend a day or a week. Something about their technical environment, how confident or familiar they are with different software, how much time they spend online, etc., what kind of access considerations there might be. And then also, crucially, what their motivations and goals are. Why would they want this? If it's mandated, how are they going to respond? Would they do it in a hurry? Would they do it last minute? How might they access it and use it? What are they trying to get done? And that's really, really crucial, that what's their goal. Very often, and I think that a lot of the examples that Mark showed, particularly the YouTube examples, people don't have learning as their goal. Very rarely do we have learning as our goal. We have something else that learning helps us do. And it's really crucial in developing these personas to understand what are those motivation factors, and what other things they might use to meet this end. It's very important, again, and we've seen everybody likes, in the chat, everybody likes to use Google, everybody likes to use YouTube. That's everyone's first port of call. So when we're developing something from a corporate perspective, think about how it competes with what's freely available online already, because that's probably your most important substitute for what you're making. So thanks, Mark. So if we're thinking about, if you've got then 2, 3 perhaps or more personas that are your pictures of real people, as a really good way of trying to understand, of constructing a statement that you can then develop and test against as to what are they trying to get done. And this is the notion of a user story, which is one of the tools, mainly from Agile product development, Agile project management, that you articulate a user story that as a role or a person I want something, a feature or a content or a tool or a product, so that your reason. So the idea is that you can state clearly for a real person what do they need or want, and what are they trying to get done with it. And it's really important to construct these in their own language when you develop a user story, and to make sure they're developed on kind of real scenarios and real outcomes as well. User stories can be constructed at different levels, so you can have large scale generic ones, and those that are much more specific, and that can be tested. You need to be careful that you don't make them so general that you end up basically with something that you can't tackle. Try and develop a user story you know that you can develop against quite quickly.
Myles, it's Joan here. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to draw your attention to a question from Rich.
Sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat. I beg your pardon.
So it's okay. Richard's just said, what do you recommend as a way to validate user stories?
I think I would say that validate them from users, to make sure that you've seen or heard from enough users and learners that that's something that is a real requirement, and that you understand, and that it's expressed in their own language as well. So I think it would be research and observation as a way of validating that you've got something that's a real requirement and a real need from a user's point of view.
And how many users do people need to contact? I know when I've done user testing where I've actually got the product there, we found that maybe 5 or 6 people is generally enough to get a flavour of what the key issues might be. But in terms of user research, how many people would you aim to talk to?
Well, there's a bit of a piece of string answer to that, I guess. You need to be, I guess, satisfied that you've got a really good understanding, and it's solid. I suppose from a testing point of view, I'd say you're right. Usually 5 or 6. After you've done 2 or 3 tests, you usually get the same. You get a sense that the same findings are coming out, and when that's consistent, you can be happy. I mean, if you've got a huge organization, then you need to be conscious that you're getting insights from enough different places. So I think it's more about making sure that the findings you get are consistent, and frequent enough that you know that you're on the right tracks. I think, if you've got a small organization that's only a few hundred people, then that obviously would be fewer than if you had a very large population. Is that okay?
Sorry, I was back on mute. Yeah, that's fine. There are some conversations going on. Kevin and Debbie are talking to each other, but that's fine.
That's good. So I find it really hard for everybody. I'm one of these unreconstructed people who finds it very hard to do more than one thing at a time. So I can speak and read. That's quite tricky. Speak and read 2 things at once is definitely beyond my capability. But I'll try and keep an eye on the chat.
I'm happy to draw things to your attention, Myles, if people do have questions like that, as long as you don't mind me interrupting.
Yeah, no, go ahead. That's what we're here for. Thank you. So I think have a look at, can I have the next slide, please, Mark? So there's some examples of user stories. So hopefully these might help think about how to both develop them and validate them. So what I tried to do here, so as I said, they need to be specific and real. So the first one is as a potential user of I'm assuming that everyone has a My something or other portal or something like it. I want to be able to find up-to-date information quickly so that I can get on with my work. That's quite a general one. It may be that actually you'd need to break that down into more specific. Something like, as a new staff member, I want to find out how much parental leave I'm entitled to so that I can plan my childcare. The idea here is, and you can read each of them, the idea is that you've got a real outcome that you can understand whether you've met that outcome or not, and you've got a sense of the motivation and a sense of where that need comes from. So, and obviously, you can imagine many and various different user stories that you could develop. And one of the most important things, as well as being able to understand whether you're meeting that need and testing against it, is developing the user stories are quite a good way. And if you share them amongst your team and others as well, they're quite a good way of understanding where everybody needs to focus. Again, it's only one tool, but it's quite a helpful way of bringing the needs behind those personas to life. Thanks. So, and finally, I think one of the most important things that I could recommend, and it's probably, if you're going to remember anything, hopefully it will be this, is that I think it's always really important to do some kind of prototyping or early concept development before you start production. And I'd say this is before piloting. Often if you're piloting something, you've decided you're going to do it. I think I would recommend prototyping before you decided and put resources against something. You can do this. One of the favorite ways, although my drawing skills are poor, paper prototyping is excellent. It's an excellent way of you sort of thinking out loud and sketching what you need. You can get some very early responses to the concept. If it's content that you need, then you can set up quickly a WordPress site or something very similar for free, and you can then share that as openly as you need to. You can put as much or as little content into that as you like and get people's responses. You get a sense from that as well of how easy or difficult it is to produce, which can be very helpful. Similarly, if it's video content, then share it privately on YouTube or openly on YouTube, depending on your requirements and outcomes. So it's really the idea being to simply, quickly, and hopefully cheaply, and sometimes freely, you can make a start. I think there's also, on the right hand side, this is an example of a screen grab from a wireframing tool called Mockflow, which is one of many free wireframing tools where if you're actually at the early stages of mocking up a system or a new product, you can actually then start to share something amongst yourselves and with users as well of how does this experience work, something that people can click through, they can read through, they can look at more or less high fidelity designs. The crucial thing here is that there are options, and again this is only a handful of things that you can do to develop your content and services and get that early feedback so that you can understand how best to meet the needs, but also understand what the real needs are underneath what people might say they want. So those are tools that I would recommend. Probably if I had to pick one, I'd always pick WordPress. Thank you.
As Myles was talking, I just was thinking that a couple of useful resources which I will put into the chat box in a minute. One is the government digital service. The UK government has spent a lot of money and done a huge amount of work in working out how to do digital services better. And the GDS has built a service manual which anyone can access. If you search for GDS service manual, and that describes their process for how they do design and develop their digital services. And a huge bulk of that is around user research, building prototypes, testing them, rebuilding them, retesting them, and not even building something digital until you've done a lot of testing in the first place. So they have a really well thought out process. It's one I use a lot these days. The other link which I'll put in is Kathy Moore and her action mapping approach to designing learning materials. And that's very much based around what's the business objective. Then, so once you've worked that out, then you say, okay, what do we need people to be able to do to achieve this business objective? And then what practice activities can we put in place to help them do that thing? And then right at the end, what resources do they need? What knowledge do they need to be able to do those practice activities? Most of the time when we design online learning materials, we start from the knowledge first and then just give them a massive dump of everything they need to know. Whereas actually her approach is really very much real world. What does someone need in order to be able to do the practice, in order to be able to do the job better? Yes, it is a very competence-based approach to learning design, Nick. I'll put those links in the chat room in a minute. And as John says, Kathy Moore's book is out very, very soon. So does anyone have any questions, further questions to either myself or Myles to pick up on any of the things we've said? If you want to put those questions into the chat box, sorry, I should have said.
Mark, while we wait for some questions to come in, can you say a bit more about competence-based design, in case people are not familiar with it? Okay,
well, let me just find Kathy's, action mapping, Kathy Moore. So here we go. I don't have these things in my head, so off to my second brain. So if you do search for Kathy Moore action mapping, but I'll put this link in the chat room now. The way she describes it, if I can just find the right, there we go. That one. Okay. So you start with what's the measurable goal that you want to achieve? Then you think, okay, what are the different behaviors that are going to help out, that are used by people to achieve that goal? So you look at someone who's selling widgets really well. What are their behaviors? What is it that they do that helps them to do that, to achieve their widget sales? Then you design practice activities for people that help them towards those behaviors. And then, only then, that's when you look at the information that they need to be able to do those practice activities. And if you look on Kathy Moore's website, she's got lots of example online learning materials, not necessarily hers. She's collected them together from all over the place that you can use as examples of this action mapping approach. And I'd really recommend it to everyone. The other one I mentioned, here we go, GDS Service Manual, is this. And there we go. So, no, sorry, not that one. It's the Agile Delivery. So if you look in their Agile working with Agile Methods section, they've got a whole load of stuff about writing user stories, how you plan it, and the different processes that you go through to design your digital services or digital anything really. So again, I'll put that into the chat room. So both of those resources, Kathy Moore and GDS, I use on a weekly basis with people because they are so useful, so good. So yeah, I would recommend them highly.
Can I ask you a question, Mark and Myles? There's a big debate in e-learning at the moment about whether people should be developing courses or resources, and the debate also between formal and informal learning. You know, you're talking, as I understand it, you're talking about using these tools when you know that you've got to develop some materials which could be a course. What in the main, what are you offering people? Are you saying to people, don't bother with courses anymore? You know, just put some resources up there and let them help themselves, like a Google search.
I would say the number of times you need a course is very small. If you look at the 70-20-10 approach, which the numbers don't really matter, it's more the sizes of them. So very few people are actually going to need a full-blown course to do things. You know, you really only need a course when it's something new. You're starting from scratch, or you want to get to a new heightened level of certification or something like that. Whereas you're much more often going to need resources and be able to find something to get you over that little hump to help you do something better. So I would say start with resources and then use them to build courses maybe. The problem is our systems, our processes within L&D are all designed around courses, and we don't really have very good tools to actually make resources available. I think it was Debbie mentioned in the chat room earlier that yes. They're putting their resources into SharePoint so people can find them more easily. And the key thing about that is they need to be searchable. As soon as you put a SCORM package into a learning management system, you stop people being able to search for it. I usually describe a learning management system as a place where content goes to die. Content needs to be in a place where you can find it, and you will never find it in a learning management system. You'll go there if you're directed to it, but that's about it.
But I suppose the other challenge is L&D stuck in a world where we're expecting to measure everything that moves. So, you know, if you're offering, if you spend time creating material or resources or whatever, or courses, you're supposed to be using your LMS to track how many people have done it, etc.
I think I think it's true. I mean, I think probably. I guess I suppose if you start, I think someone just mentioned this in the chat room. I think it was Kevin saying that if you start from the principle of user need, I'd be surprised if you came up with a course many times, because I don't think many users are thinking of courses. When you call someone a learner, you start to nudge them towards courses and learning activity rather than thinking them as a user with a problem to solve. Then our responsibility is to design a useful solution to that problem. And I think that the notion, I think that the LMS is problematic because we do tend to get obsessed with tracking things in an LMS. Most content resources offer some way of measuring activity as well, so you're not bereft of information if you don't present your content in an LMS. You have a different kind of information. A lot of that information works very well for the advertising industry, who are quite who are even more obsessed with measurement than learning. So I think tracking can be it doesn't necessarily answer the data problem as well.
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of things to that. One is a nice little phrase that I picked up years ago, which is, too often we make the measurable important rather than the important measurable. It's so easy to measure stuff online, but most of the time those measurements don't mean anything. One very good example is, in SCORM packages, we are given information that tells us how long someone was using that SCORM package for. It tells us nothing about whether they've learned anything. It just tells us they had that thing open on that screen at the time. They could have been off to make a cup of coffee all the time. The other thing is that actually we don't need an LMS anymore to measure things. With the dawn of XAPI, or Tin Can, as it's sometimes called, we can actually get tracking data out of systems that are nowhere near an LMS. Content management systems, for example, or even just raw content can send tracking data to a learning record store.
Okay. So we've had one or two questions, not that many, but I will say, if anybody feels they'd like to speak on the webinar, if they put their hand up, then I can promote them and then unmute them. So we'll give you that option as well today. Kevin's put in a question, Mark.
Okay, yeah. So if we're measuring in the LMS, what are people doing that's adding value in the LMS? Okay, so that sounds like it's a general question to everyone. So it might be an idea if people responded to that in the chat room. But I would say that the times when an LMS really adds value are in assessment, primarily. They are a great way to assess someone's knowledge or someone's capabilities, and for capturing that information. The LMS is not a good content delivery tool, but it is a great assessment delivery tool. So my recommendation would be keep your content outside the LMS, put your assessments inside.
I'd like to pick up on Kevin's point, if I may, because he's saying assess knowledge, yes, but can they do the job? And one of my frustrations, because I do quite a lot of compliance e-learning and classroom training, and one of my frustrations is the gap between a learning experience and then the performance on the job. I know everybody struggles with this, but my aim has always been to try and persuade people to get managers involved. So, for example, if you have a compliance course and the regulators demand that you demonstrate compliance, yes, you can put a course in place. But why not invite managers to have team talks with their teams once everybody's done it, and then actually say, so what does this mean for us? And loads of clients have said, oh, well, we can't measure that, so there's no point trying to do it.
Yeah, there's a massive debate around compliance, isn't there, Joan? Are we compliant because we offer training, or are we compliant because we're actually not making mistakes anymore? I know there was an example in the nuclear industry a few years back where they stopped measuring the training, but they actually started measuring, or they published the measures of health and safety incidents. So by putting the compliance training in place, they improved their figures on health and safety. And that was the measure of compliance, rather than did everyone do the training.
So output or impact, not...
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
No, I agree with you. So still, there's a few more comments going in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I suppose that I wonder about the kind of. I think there's a false security in LMS data and the tracking of it. As Mark said, I mean, it's just a different way of measuring consumption of content. It's like I could say I'm going to tell you a joke, but whether you laugh or not is whether you think it's funny. So I think. It's an odd thing. I don't know. The LMS has sort of worked itself into a place of authoritative data in an organisation. When I think actually we're measuring it against the wrong standard. I don't think we should measure the effectiveness of learning interventions against the old rule of the LMS. I think we should probably, as someone said, we should find a different way of understanding it in the first place. Really. I'm not sure exactly what I would suggest, but I think that there's different ways, and I think that the Tin Can API is a good step in that direction of trying to bring more real life data from the workplace into understanding patterns of behaviour around learning content and learning experiences.
There was a comment earlier on as well. It might have been from Debbie, but it was about millennials and how they're maybe expecting a different approach. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think they probably are, but I don't think they're alone. I think I think everybody's now personal experience of digital products has changed what we expect from technology. So I think the fact that we're all smartphone users using apps, we're using YouTube, etc., we're using social tools. Those are all the things that define our expectations. I think often we point to millennials as the kind of the risk. I think there's lots of people who are over 50 are using Facebook, obsessively, and that's a great experience for them. So I think millennials do offer a clue. I think it's more about just to see what where are users gathering, what the kinds of tools are being used. I think those are setting the expectations that we need to meet.
Yeah, there's quite a few comments going in about measuring changes in behaviour rather than data. John Curran has posted a comment about learning analytics. Do either of you want to say something about that, or shall I bring John in to the conversation?
Let's bring John in. He's always got something good to say.
John, I shall promote you. I'll do it the right way. Hold on. And then I need to unmute you.
Oh, hi, Joan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now.
Okay, good. I didn't expect to talk. Yeah, I mean, we're hearing a lot more, especially from technology vendors, about learning analytics. So do you think is this a direction that it's useful to go in, or are we just fooling ourselves even more that we can track exactly what people learn?
What do we mean by learning analytics, though? Is it different from LMS data? Well,
I'm assuming it's almost like, I'm guessing it's taking it a step further. So picking up on Tin Can and the X API. So I'm assuming it's doing more of that. I mean, I'm seeing it more used in education than in industry, but I'm sure we're going to get it in industry too.
Yeah, so in higher education particularly, there's a huge amount of work going on in learning analytics. But in higher education, their focus is on learning as an end. So that all their data is about the inputs and the outputs from that learning process. Whereas in workplace learning world, learning isn't the end. Learning is the means to the end. So what we need to be doing is collecting the data that can say whether the learning has had an impact. And that's where XAPI can really make a difference. It isn't yet. We haven't got to that point, but the potential is there. What it can do is you don't just collect the learning data. You can collect the performance data and then start to correlate the two. So the example I always give is, let's say you're in a call center and you're using a case management system to track the cases going through. That data about successful case closures and how long things are taking, and number of calls that they're able to deal with. That could all be stored within a learning record store. And that could be correlated then with data that you collect from your learning content that talks about how often people are using a particular piece of content, or what happened after a particular piece of content was released. Did it have an impact on performance? And we can start collecting that data together. XAPI allows us to collect pretty much any data we want, as long as the systems can generate it. So that's the end goal. That's sort of the level 4 of XAPI use. We're not there yet. At the moment, the only people really using XAPI are people in the learning space, rather than people in the operations and performance space. But we're starting to see some case studies coming through. If you look on the Rustici website, or Rustici website, they've got some very good case studies about where XAPI is starting to make a difference and starting to collect really useful data.
Okay.
Right, okay. Thanks, Mark.
John, that might be something to pick up on at our annual conference in November.
Definitely.
Registration is now open. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I wonder, could you pull up the last slide, Mark?
Certainly.
More information about the network.
There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, just to recap, I've got everybody's email, and some people obviously haven't managed to join, but I will distribute the chat and the PDF of the slides and the link to the recording. And if you're interested in the October webinar, that's about e-learning project management with Shona Smart of Ecom Scotland. And we'll soon be releasing details of the November one, which is with Neil Lasher, and it's all about mentoring. And you can sign up now to the conference, which is in London on the 7th of November. I haven't booked any sessions for January, February onwards. So if there are any topics that you would like to see, please let us know and we'll try and fit them in. Any other comments? We've had some good feedback, and quite a lot of 68% are nearly everybody's likely to come. Well, everybody who's signed up, who's done the feedback poll, says they'll like to join another webinar in future. So that's good too. So I think all that remains for me to do then is to encourage you to read Mark and Myles, to read the feedback that's coming into the chat room, and to thank you both for your presentation and your time, and to thank everybody for joining. So thank you.
Yes, thanks, Joan.
Thank you.
Cheers.